This video is about the adaptability of different species. Adaptability means that a species is able to adjust to and live or survive in different environmental conditions. If a particular tree can be found in a wide range of environments, that is a good indicator that it's an adaptable species. This comes into play with tree selection because you want to make sure you're picking a tree that's well adapted for your particular area and for that specific planting site. There's 4 categories: native, introduced, naturalized, and invasive. A native plant is one that evolved in your general area and is very well adapted to any of the climate and soil conditions that you expect. It's also good to plant natives because they will also support native wildlife. If you're interested in learning more about native plants, just search for your area and Native Plant Society. One thing to keep in mind though is that the native plants that you have now in your area may not necessarily have been there in the past. As the environment changes and the climate changes, different species will move in and adapt again to those new conditions. Also, if you're working in an urban area, the conditions you have may not necessarily be what was there before. When homes are constructed, for example, there's a lot of grading that happens across a site, and usually the native topsoil gets removed. So just because you have a native species that was originally adapted to what was there, now the conditions have changed and they might not be used to those conditions anymore. If you're working on a property that has a really nice landscape, some native plants don't like having extra water and extra fertilizer, so keep that in mind. The next category is introduced species, which I've also heard of as exotic or non-native species. Basically, this is any plant that's not native. It may have been brought in for food, for aesthetics, or other horticulture reasons. And unless you're working in a purely natural area, you'll probably run into introduced species quite often. One of the subcategories of introduced species is naturalized species or naturalized plants. They were also brought in from somewhere else, but this category specifically is doing well enough that they can reproduce in your area and it doesn't need additional care. I find that people who don't really know trees tend to think of this category as sometimes being native. An example would be eucalyptuses in California. Honestly, they're pretty iconic and they make up a lot of natural areas as well. And it's hard to think of California without the eucalyptuses. Some people may also describe eucalyptuses as being invasive in California. An invasive plant is a subcategory of naturalized plant. They are so successful that they're now causing environmental or financial harm. In general, invasive species tend to be more weedy and extremely adaptable. They spread and thrive in all kinds of areas, especially in disturbed areas that other species don't do as well in. They start pushing out the species that you do want. They are really hard to get rid of. There are some species that have a more narrow range in which they're invasive, like Callery pears. These escape and form thickets and they're really hard to get rid of. But in a drier state like California, these are not invasive because they don't get enough water. But there's also really broadly invasive plants like the tree of heaven. Tree of heaven is honestly a noxious weed and it's problematic everywhere. It has a lot of weedy characteristics, like it grows quickly, forms a lot of seeds, it's hard to kill. If you try to cut it down without treating it with any kind of herbicide first, the entire root system will respond by producing all these suckers, and then you get a whole forest of tree of heaven. Even if you did use herbicide ahead of time, one treatment might not be enough and you might need to do it multiple times before you're able to successfully kill off a tree. So when you're picking what trees to plant, you definitely want to stay away from invasive plants. You may also want to stay away from naturalized plants because a couple of things could change and they can establish themselves and reproduce more than you want them to. So you're left with natives and some of the less harmful or less successful non-native or introduced species. There's a strong push to plant natives, but you need to take into consideration whether that native species is actually appropriate for that specific planting location that you want. Rather than prioritizing native species simply because they're native, it's best to pick the most appropriate tree for that planting site. Right tree, right place. There's another term I've heard that are used to describe plants now called climate-ready plants. If you find the climate-ready plant list for your area, generally it will be made up of adaptable tree species from an area that's slightly warmer than you are, because the expectation is that temperatures will continue to rise. So if you plant them now, as temperatures rise, your local tree canopy will already have more diversity that's adapted to those conditions that just came in.